December 23rd, 1859, Richmond, Virginia. On the most terrifying night in the history of American slavery, a woman named Celia Washington stood in the shadows of the Holloway Plantation Manor, her eyes reflecting firelight like polished obsidian, whispering the exact hour each of her masters would draw their final breath. By dawn, 3 men lay dead, not by her hand, but by the very circumstances she had foretold with chilling precision. The slave, who could see death coming, had become death's most faithful servant, transforming from property into prophecy, from chattel into the angel of reckoning that would haunt Virginia's slave-owning elite for generations to come. Before we continue with the video, don't forget to subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. The winter of 1859 marked the end of an era that white Virginia had believed would last forever. In the heart of Richmond's most prestigious district, where magnolia trees cast shadows over cobblestone streets and gas lamps flickered against mansion windows, lived a woman who could taste death in the morning air like copper pennies on her tongue. Celia Washington, slave, seer, and soon to become legend, possessed a gift that would transform her from invisible property into the most feared woman in the Commonwealth. She served 3 masters: banker Harrison Holloway, tobacco merchant Theodore Blackwood, and railroad baron Samuel Carrington, men who owned her body but could never possess her sight. The catalyst came not in chains or whips, but in a promise broken on Christmas Eve, a promise of freedom that dissolved like sugar in bitter coffee, revealing the lie that had kept her compliant for 27 years of bondage. But Celia Washington had seen something else in her visions, something that made her master's betrayal feel like divine justice rather than human cruelty. She had seen their deaths, written in the stars above Richmond, carved into the frost on window panes, whispered by the wind through bare winter branches. This is the true story of the woman who became Richmond's angel of prophecy and death, whose visions turned prediction into power, and whose legacy would outlive every master who dared to own her. Are you ready to witness how a slave's gift of sight became a weapon sharper than any blade ever forged? The Holloway mansion blazed with warmth on that December evening, its windows casting golden rectangles across manicured gardens where slaves had once tended roses that bloomed red as fresh blood. Inside, crystal chandeliers caught candlelight and threw it back in prismatic rainbows, while servants in pressed uniforms glided between guests, carrying silver trays laden with bourbon and honeyed ham. The air hung thick with cigar smoke, magnolia perfume, and the sweet decay of power grown too comfortable with itself. But beyond the manor's glowing warmth, in the slave quarters that squatted like broken teeth along the property's edge, another world breathed in shadows and suffering. Here, winter winds sliced through gaps in hastily built walls, carrying the smell of ash from dying cooking fires and the sharper scent of fierce sweat that never quite washed clean. Children huddled together on straw pallets, their breath visible in the frigid air, while mothers sang lullabies that sounded more like funeral dirges than songs of comfort. Celia Washington sat alone in her corner of the women's quarters, her back pressed against boards that had been seasoned by decades of tears, her eyes fixed on something invisible to everyone else. The other slaves gave her space. They had learned to respect the sight that lived behind those dark eyes, the gift that let her taste tomorrow's sorrows into night's dreams. She saw patterns in the frost on windows, read fortunes in the way shadows fell across doorways, felt death approaching like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. Tonight felt different. The air itself seemed pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of prophecy about to birth itself into reality. She could smell copper and sulfur, taste salt and iron, hear the distant sound of weeping that hadn't yet begun. In the manor, masters laughed and clinked glasses, toasting. Another profitable year built on the backs of human chattel. They had no idea that their slave's seer had already attended their funerals, had already seen their graves filled with Virginia clay, had already heard the sound of their wives screaming their names into winter darkness. The juxtaposition was perfect, warmth and cold, light and shadow, celebration and mourning, life and the death that stalked just beyond the edge of sight. Celia Washington had been born with eyes that saw too much and a mind that could never unknow what those eyes revealed. As a child, she had whispered about accidents before they happened, predicted illnesses before symptoms appeared, mourned deaths before hearts stopped beating. The other slaves called it a gift from God. The masters called it dangerous superstition. Celia herself knew it as a burden heavier than any cotton sack she had ever carried across sun-scorched fields. For 27 years, she had carried the weight of foresight like a stone in her chest. She had seen herself grow old in bondage, had watched her children sold away in visions that came true with biblical certainty, had tasted the bitter knowledge that freedom was a word that existed for her only in dreams. The sight that others envied had become her cruelest master, showing her every tragedy she was powerless to prevent, every loss she was doomed to endure, every chain that would bind her until death. But tonight, something had shifted in the cosmic machinery that governed her visions. For the first time in her life, she saw death approaching not as loss, but as liberation. She saw it stalking the very men who owned her, moving through their lives like cancer through healthy tissue, inevitable and absolute. The realization filled her with something she had never experienced before. Not quite happiness, but a deep, dark satisfaction that tasted like honey mixed with poison. The psychology of the seer had always been complex. She lived simultaneously in present and future, experiencing events before they occurred, mourning losses before they happened. This temporal displacement had created a woman who seemed perpetually detached from the moment, as if she existed slightly outside the normal flow of time. Other slaves found her unsettling. Masters found her useful for her uncanny ability to predict weather and crops, but none truly understood the psychic toll of carrying tomorrow's sorrows in today's heart. But now, with death circling her masters like wolves around wounded deer, Celia felt something approaching peace. For once, her gift served justice rather than bondage. For once, her sight revealed not suffering, but salvation. Not her own, perhaps, but a reckoning that would echo through generations of Virginia aristocracy like thunder rolling across empty skies. The promise had been made 3 summers ago, whispered in the tobacco barn where Harrison Holloway conducted business he preferred to keep hidden from his wife's sharp ears and sharper tongue. Celia had seen him coming, of course, had tasted his approach in the morning air, like rain before storms. She had known what he would offer, and what he would take in return. "Freedom papers," he had said, his voice thick with bourbon and desire. "Your freedom and passage north. But first you must tell me what you see coming for my investments. The railroad stocks, the cotton futures, the shipping contracts. I need to know which way the wind will blow before it starts blowing." For 3 years, Celia had traded prophecy for promises. She had told Holloway which ships would sink, which crops would fail, which partnerships would crumble into bankruptcy and disgrace. Her visions had made him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, had helped him navigate the treacherous waters of antebellum economics with the precision of a man who could see around corners. In return, he had sworn by his mother's grave that Celia would taste freedom before her 28th birthday. But Christmas Eve had brought betrayal wrapped in legal papers and sealed with the authority of Virginia law. Instead of freedom papers, Holloway had presented documents transferring Celia's ownership to his business partner, Theodore Blackwood. The promise of liberation had dissolved into the reality of another master, another chain, another broken vow in a life built on broken vows. The betrayal cut deeper than any whip because it had been preceded by hope. For 3 years, Celia had allowed herself to dream of freedom, had imagined walking through northern cities where her gifts might serve herself rather than slave masters. She had seen herself teaching other freedwomen to read the signs and portents that surrounded their daily lives, had envisioned using her sight to help rather than merely to serve. But as she sat in the slave quarters on that December night, feeling the weight of yet another master's ownership settling on her shoulders like lead blankets, Celia realized that her visions had been incomplete. She had seen the betrayal coming, had tasted it in her dreams for weeks, But she had also seen something else. She had seen Holloway's death, and Blackwood's death, and Carrington's death, and she understood now that these visions were not warnings to be shared, but prophecies to be witnessed. In the hours before dawn, Celia Washington prepared for battle, not with steel or rope or poison, but with something far more dangerous: absolute faith in her gift. She moved through the slave quarters like a ghost, gathering secrets, touching objects that held the imprint of future violence, collecting the invisible tools that would transform prophecy into power. Her first weapon was knowledge. She knew that Harrison Holloway would die at precisely 2:17 a.m., choking on his own blood in the tobacco warehouse where he had made his fortune selling human misery. She knew that Theodore Blackwood would follow at dawn, his heart exploding in his chest as he read the morning papers that would announce his financial ruin. She knew that Samuel Carrington would meet his end at sunset, crushed beneath the wheels of his own locomotive as he tried to flee Richmond with stolen railroad bonds. Her second weapon was patience. For years, she had been forced to share her visions with masters who used her gift for profit while keeping her in chains. Tonight, for the first time, her sight served only herself. She would watch death collect its debts without warning, without intervention, without the slightest attempt to prevent what she had already seen carved in stone. Her third weapon was theatricality. Celia understood that power was not just about knowing the future. It was about making others believe you controlled it. She arranged herself in the Manor's garden at the exact hour of Holloway's death, positioning herself where other slaves would see her silhouette against the night sky. She whispered his name 3 times as the church bell chimed, then stood perfectly still as screams erupted from the warehouse district. Her fourth weapon was reputation. By morning, every slave in Richmond would know that Celia Washington had foretold Holloway's death to the minute. By evening, they would whisper that she had called down Blackwood's heart attack with a single glance. By the week's end, they would swear that she had summoned Carrington's locomotive like a metal demon to claim its master's soul. The preparation was not about creating death. Death needed no assistance from mortal hands. The preparation was about becoming the vessel through which death's message would be delivered, the dark prophet who transformed random tragedy into divine justice. Celia Washington was preparing to become Richmond's angel of reckoning, and her only weapons were sight, timing, and the terrible power of reputation transformed into legend. Harrison Holloway, 53 years old, carried his sins like a tumor in his chest, swollen, pulsing, poisonous. He had built his fortune on 3 pillars of Virginia commerce: tobacco, slaves, and the misery that connected them both. His hands, soft as a baby's from never touching honest labor, bore the invisible stains of every whipping he had ordered, every family he had separated, every dream he had crushed beneath the weight of ownership. He walked through Richmond's social circles like a wolf among sheep, charming and deadly, his smile hiding teeth sharp enough to tear flesh from bone. Celia had seen his death 1,000 times in her visions, always the same warehouse, always the same time, always the same choking sound, as blood-filled lungs that had grown fat on others' suffering. He would die alone, calling for help that would never come, understanding finally what it felt like to be powerless and afraid. His last words would be his slave name for her: Witch. Theodore Blackwood, 47 years old, possessed a heart made of fool's gold, glittering and worthless, destined to crumble under pressure. He collected slaves like other men collected stamps, trading human beings with the casual indifference of someone arranging furniture. His ledger books recorded lives bought and sold with the same attention to detail he applied to tobacco shipments and cotton futures. He took pride in his efficiency, his ability to calculate human worth down to the penny. His death would come courtesy of his own greed. The railroad bonds he had stolen, the partnerships he had betrayed, the financial manipulations that had made him wealthy, all would converge in a single moment of terror that would stop his heart like a fist crushing a butterfly. He would die reading his own obituary in the morning paper, understanding too late that Celia had seen his reckoning written in the stars. Samuel Carrington, 61 years old, had spent his life building railroads that carried other men's slaves to market, while his own conscience lay buried beneath layers of profit and justification. His locomotive empire stretched across 3 states, each mile of track laid with the sweat of unpaid labor, each station built with the tears of separated families. He believed himself untouchable, protected by wealth and influence, and the certainty that God blessed those who prospered. His death would be poetic justice, crushed beneath the wheels of the iron horse he had ridden to wealth and power. The locomotive would find him at sunset, metal meeting flesh in a collision that would echo like thunder across Richmond's elite. He would have just enough time to see Celia Washington watching from the platform, her eyes reflecting the approaching headlight like mirrors reflecting fire. At 2:17 a.m., as Celia Washington stood silhouetted against the winter moon, Harrison Holloway collapsed in Warehouse 7 of the Richmond Tobacco Exchange, blood frothing from his mouth like wine from a broken bottle. He had been alone, counting the profits from his latest slave auction, when something vital ruptured in his chest. The ledger book fell from his hands, its pages spreading across the floor like wings of a dying bird, each entry recording a life reduced to dollars and cents. His death throes lasted exactly 4 minutes. Celia had counted them in her visions, had memorized the rhythm of his final gasps like a funeral song. He called her name once, then twice, then fell silent as blood filled the spaces where words used to live. The tobacco warehouse, that cathedral of commerce built on human suffering, became his tomb. At dawn's first light, Theodore Blackwood opened the Richmond Dispatch to find headlines that stopped his heart like a punch to the chest. Railroad bonds exposed as fraudulent, Blackwood empire crumbles. The financial scandal that Celia had seen brewing for months erupted across the front page in letters that might as well have been carved in his tombstone. His body was discovered in his counting house, still clutching the newspaper, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. As sunset painted the sky blood red, Samuel Carrington made his final run on the Richmond-Petersburg Railroad, fleeing the city with stolen bonds hidden in his personal car. But Celia had seen this moment countless times, had watched it unfold like a recurring nightmare. The locomotive's brakes failed at precisely the moment Carrington leaned out to signal the engineer. He fell beneath his own iron horse, was crushed by the weight of metal and steam, and the accumulated sins of 30 years in the slave trade. 3 masters, 3 deaths, 3 prophecies filled with the precision of clockwork. Celia Washington never moved from her position in the Manor Garden, never lifted a finger in violence, never spoke a word of threat or curse. She simply watched as death collected its debts, as the future she had foreseen bloomed into terrible reality, like flowers opening in fast-motion photography. By midnight, word had spread through Richmond's slave quarters, like wildfire through dry grass. The seer had seen death coming and had chosen silence over warning. The prophet had become an angel of judgment, transforming from victim into divine instrument. Celia Washington had found her true power, not in preventing the future, but in allowing it to unfold with biblical inevitability. Dawn broke over Richmond like blood seeping through bandages, revealing a city transformed by death and whispers. The bodies had been discovered within hours of each other. Holloway in his warehouse, Blackwood in his counting house, Carrington beside his locomotive. But the real discovery was something far more dangerous, the realization that a slave woman had foretold each death with supernatural precision. Word spread through the slave quarters faster than yellow fever through summer air. Kitchen servants whispered over morning biscuits about how Celia had stood in the garden at the exact moment of Holloway's death. Stable hands swore they had seen her lips moving in silent prayer as Blackwood's heart exploded. House slaves crossed themselves and spoke in hushed tones about the woman who could call down death with a glance. But whispers among slaves were one thing. Whispers among masters were quite another. By noon, Richmond's white elite had gathered in drawing rooms and private clubs, their voices tight with something they refused to call fear. 3 prominent businessmen, didn't simply die in a single night without cause, and the cause that terrified them most was the one they couldn't see or touch or chain: a slave's gift turned weapon. Sheriff Marcus Donnelly, a man whose mustache couldn't hide the weakness of his chin, found himself facing the most delicate investigation of his career. How do you arrest a woman for predicting death? How do you charge someone with knowing too much? The law books contained no precedent for prosecuting prophecy, no statute against seeing the future, no crime called possession of supernatural sight. But Richmond's masters didn't need legal precedent. They needed someone to blame, someone to punish, someone to break in order to restore the natural order that had been shattered by supernatural intervention. They needed Celia Washington to be more than a seer. They needed her to be a witch, a murderer, a monster who could be destroyed by rope and fire and the collective will of white supremacy. The immediate aftermath was a city holding its breath, waiting to see whether justice would wear the face of law or the mask of lynch mob. Every slave owner in Richmond suddenly found themselves checking shadows for signs of doom, listening to their kitchen help with new attention, wondering if their own deaths had already been prophesied by dark eyes that saw too much. Celia Washington remained in the slave quarters, surrounded by women who looked at her with a mixture of awe and terror. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had transformed from property into prophecy, from victim into something approaching divinity. The question now was whether Richmond would worship her or burn her, and whether the difference mattered when you were already dead to the law. They came for her on the third day, when fear had fermented into fury, and Richmond's elite had convinced themselves that a slave's supernatural gifts posed a greater threat than 3 convenient deaths. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones like guilt refusing to lift, and somewhere in the distance, church bells tolled with the solemnity of funeral dirges. Sheriff Marcus Donnelly arrived at dawn with 6 deputies, their boots echoing against wet stone with the rhythm of an execution march, their faces set in the grim expressions of men who had been ordered to arrest the impossible and make it look legal. Each deputy carried the weight of sleepless nights in the dark circles beneath their eyes, nights spent wondering if a slave woman's curse might find them in their dreams, nights haunted by the possibility that death could be summoned with nothing more than a glance from eyes that saw too much. The air itself seemed thick with portent as they approached the slave quarters, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and fierce sweat, pregnant with the kind of electricity that precedes thunderstorms. Behind curtained windows, Richmond's white families held their breath, waiting to see if their representatives could capture prophecy itself and drag it before the altar of Virginia justice. The very foundations of their world had been shaken by the revelation that their human property possessed gifts that transcended ownership, that a woman they had considered barely more than livestock could see their deaths written in the stars and choose silence over salvation. Celia Washington was waiting for them, of course. She had seen this moment as clearly as she had seen the deaths, had known the exact time they would come for her, the words they would speak, the chains they would use, the number of steps between her quarters and the courthouse basement. She sat on the weathered wooden steps of the slave quarters, like a queen holding court, her back straight as a rod of iron, her hands folded in her lap with the composure of someone who had already lived through this moment countless times in visions that played behind her closed eyelids like scenes from a recurring nightmare. Her eyes reflected the morning sun like polished obsidian, dark mirrors that seemed to hold depths no white man had ever fathomed, depths that contained the accumulated sorrows of her people and the terrible knowledge of futures yet to unfold. The fabric of her rough-spun dress bore the stains of countless days of labor, but she wore it with the dignity of ermine and silk. Around her neck hung a small piece of carved bone, a protection charm her grandmother had given her, passed down through generations of women who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters between slavery and survival. Her hair, usually covered by the kerchief that marked her status, fell in tight coils around her shoulders like a crown of defiance, and when she breathed, the vapor from her breath rose into the cold air like incense from an altar. Celia Washington, Sheriff Donnelly announced, his voice carrying the false authority of a man who knew he was performing theater rather than enforcing law, each syllable carefully modulated to project confidence he didn't feel. The name seemed to hang in the air like smoke, charged with power that made the deputies shift uncomfortably on their feet. They had heard the stories whispered in Richmond's taverns and drawing rooms, tales that grew more supernatural with each telling, legends that transformed a slave woman into something approaching divinity through the simple act of seeing clearly what others refused to acknowledge. You're under arrest for suspicion of murder in the deaths of Harrison Holloway, Theodore Blackwood, and Samuel Carrington. The words tasted like ashes in Donnelly's mouth. Legal formalities applied to circumstances that transcended law, charges that existed more in desperate imagination than judicial precedent. She rose without resistance, her movements fluid as water flowing downhill, inevitable as sunrise, graceful as a dancer performing steps choreographed by fate itself. When they placed the shackles on her wrists, iron bands that clicked shut with the finality of coffin lids, she allowed them to bind her with the patient tolerance of someone who understood that some chains were temporary, while others lasted lifetimes. The metal felt cold against skin that had known bondage since birth, but these particular chains carried a different weight, the weight of acknowledgement that she had transcended her status as property and become something far more dangerous, a symbol, a prophet, a woman whose gifts had made masters mortal and slaves aware of their own hidden power. She walked between the deputies like a condemned saint heading toward martyrdom, her feet finding purchase on stones made slick with morning dew, her stride never faltering despite the shackles that bound her ankles. The other slaves watched from doorways and windows, their faces carved with expressions of grief and awe and something approaching reverence that made the deputies nervous with its intensity. They were witnessing the arrest of their prophet, the capture of the woman who had dared to make masters mortal, the binding of hands that had never lifted in violence but had somehow managed to bring death to those who thought themselves untouchable. Children pressed their faces against glass panes fogged with their breath, their eyes wide with the terrible understanding that something fundamental had shifted in their world. Women clutched their shawls closer around their shoulders, not against the morning chill, but against the implications of what they were witnessing. Men stood in doorways with their hands clenched into fists they would never be allowed to use, watching their seer being led away to face the kind of justice that Virginia reserved for slaves who dared to challenge the natural order through supernatural means. The interrogation took place in the basement of the county courthouse, in a room designed to break spirits through darkness and humidity, and the constant drip of water through cracked stone that counted time like a metronome of despair. The walls sweated with condensation that might have been tears, and the air tasted of mold and fear, and the accumulated anguish of countless souls who had been brought here to confess sins both real and imagined. Candles flickered in iron sconces, their flames dancing with each breath, casting shadows that writhed across stone surfaces like living things seeking escape from the oppressive atmosphere of official interrogation. Sheriff Donnelly sat across from Celia at a table scarred by decades of confessions extracted through fear and pain, its wooden surface bearing the gouges and stains that told stories of broken fingernails and spilled blood and tears that had fallen like rain upon its weathered planks. City Prosecutor Hamilton Reed paced the shadows like a theatrical villain, his footsteps echoing off walls that had absorbed countless screams, his expensive suit incongruous in a space designed for the kind of rough justice that preferred darkness to daylight, coercion to due process. "How did you know they would die?" Reed demanded, his voice echoing off walls that seemed to lean inward with malevolent attention, each word bouncing back with distorted emphasis that made his questions sound like accusations hurled from the depths of hell itself. "What did you do to them? Who helped you? What kind of poison did you use? What spells did you cast? What devils did you summon? What contracts did you sign in blood?" The questions came like hammer blows against an anvil, rapid-fire interrogation designed to overwhelm and confuse, to break down resistance through sheer repetition and volume. Reed's face grew red with exertion and frustration as he hurled accusation after accusation at a woman who sat as still as stone, as serene as a marble statue carved by angels, her composure a stark contrast to the violence of his inquiry. But Celia Washington simply smiled, her face serene as a marble statue's, her voice carrying the authority of absolute truth when she finally spoke, each word measured and deliberate, carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "I didn't kill anyone, Mr. Reed. I simply saw what was already written. Death came for them the way it comes for everyone, when their time was finished and their debts came due." The interrogation continued for hours, questions hammering against Sil, ants like waves against stone cliffs, threats dissolving into frustration as they met the immovable force of supernatural certainty, legal procedure crumbling beneath the weight of supernatural impossibility. How do you prosecute someone for seeing the future? How do you convict a prophet for knowing too much? How do you execute someone whose only crime was witnessing justice arrive precisely on schedule, dressed in the clothes of natural consequence and cosmic balance? The trial of Celia Washington began on February 14, 1860, and Richmond transformed it into the greatest theatrical production in Virginia's history. The courthouse overflowed with spectators who had traveled from as far as Charleston and Baltimore to witness the prosecution of a woman who had dared to prophesy her master's deaths. Newspaper reporters filled the front rows, their pencils poised to capture every word of what the Richmond Whig called the trial of the century. Judge Ezekiel Thornton, a man whose black robes made him look like death's accountant, presided over proceedings that blurred the line between legal process and public execution. The prosecution, led by Hamilton Reed, presented a case built on fear rather than evidence, superstition rather than law, the desperate need to punish someone for crimes that couldn't be proven. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Reed proclaimed, his voice rising to fill the packed courtroom, "we are not here to try a simple murder case. We are here to determine whether the natural order of Virginia society will be maintained or whether we will allow slaves to terrorize their masters through supernatural means." But Reed's case crumbled like sandcastles before incoming tide. No physical evidence connected Celia to any death. No witnesses had seen her near the victims. No poison was found in any body. No weapon bore her fingerprints. No conspiracy could be proven through testimony or documentation. The prosecution's entire argument rested on the impossible premise that knowing the future constituted murder in the past. Celia's defense attorney, a reluctant young lawyer named James Morrison, who had been appointed by the court, surprised everyone by embracing the supernatural elements rather than denying them. "My client stands accused of murder," Morrison declared, "but the only thing she killed was the illusion that masters are immortal. She didn't cause these deaths. She simply saw them coming." The trial's climax came when Celia took the stand in her own defense. The courtroom fell silent as she rose, chains clinking softly around her ankles, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy when she spoke. "I have seen death my entire life. I have watched children die before they were born, seen husbands buried before they married their wives, mourned losses before they occurred. That is my gift and my burden. I saw Harrison Holloway die of greed, Theodore Blackwood die of fear, and Samuel Carrington die of the weight of his own sins. I didn't cause their deaths. I simply knew they were coming." The jury deliberated for 3 days, torn between law and legend, evidence and fear, justice and the desperate need to maintain social order through any means necessary. The verdict came down like thunder in a clear sky. Guilty of murder by supernatural means, a crime that existed nowhere in Virginia law, but everywhere in Virginia's nightmares. Judge Thornton sentenced Celia Washington to death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn on March 15, 1860, in the public square, where thousands would gather to witness the execution of Richmond's most feared prophet. But Celia had seen her own death long before the trial began, had known the exact moment when the rope would tighten around her throat, had counted the seconds between the trapdoor opening and her final breath. She faced execution not with fear, but with the serene confidence of someone who had already witnessed their own transformation from flesh into legend. The night before her execution, she spoke to her cellmate, a young slave woman named Mary, who had been arrested for stealing bread. "My death won't end anything. It will begin everything. They're not killing Celia Washington tomorrow. They're creating something that can never die, never be chained, never be owned. They're making me into memory, and memory is stronger than any master who ever lived." Dawn on March 15th brought the largest crowd in Richmond's history. Nearly 10,000 people packed the public square, climbing onto rooftops and hanging from windows to witness the execution of the woman who had prophesied 3 masters' deaths and lived to stand trial for seeing too much. The gallows stood like a wooden monument to fear, its trapdoor polished smooth by countless executions. As they placed the rope around her neck, Celia Washington spoke her final words to the crowd. "I have seen your deaths too, all of you. The masters who think themselves safe, the judges who believe themselves just, the sheriffs who imagine themselves righteous. Death comes for everyone, and it remembers everyone who stood here today. Ring for the execution of prophecy." The trap door opened at precisely 6:17 a.m., and Celia Washington's body fell into eternity. But her death accomplished something no amount of living testimony could have achieved. It transformed her from slave into saint, from prophet into legend, from Celia Washington into something approaching divinity. Within hours, stories began spreading through Virginia's slave quarters like wildfire through drought-stricken forests. They said her ghost walked through Richmond's mansions, whispering death dates to masters who tried to sleep. They said her spirit appeared to slaves in dreams, teaching them to read the signs and portents that surrounded their daily lives. They said the Seeress of Richmond had become immortal through execution, more powerful in death than she had ever been in life. In the years following Celia Washington's execution, her legend grew like kudzu vine over abandoned plantations, spreading through the Underground Railroad network, taking root in slave quarters across the South, blooming into something that transcended history and entered the realm of folk mythology. She became the Seeress of Richmond, the prophet of the quarters, the dark angel who had dared to see her master's mortality and lived, or died, to tell the tale. The American Civil War began barely a year after her execution, and slaves throughout the Confederacy whispered that Celia had prophesied this too, had seen the great reckoning coming when brother would kill brother and the institution of slavery would drown in its own blood. Union soldiers reported strange encounters with slave guides who claimed the dead seer had appeared to them in dreams, showing them safe paths through Confederate territory, revealing which masters could be trusted and which should be feared. After emancipation, Celia Washington's story evolved from whispered legend into celebrated myth. Former slaves carried her tale north and west, each retelling adding new layers of supernatural power, new demonstrations of prophetic sight, new victories over white supremacy through the simple act of seeing truth. She became a figure comparable to Harriet Tubman in the African-American folk tradition, not just a historical person, but a symbol of resistance, survival, and the power of knowledge in the face of oppression. By the 20th century, scholars and folklorists began collecting the various versions of her story, finding dozens of different accounts across the American South. Some portrayed her as a conjure woman who could curse masters with a glance. Others described her as a Christian mystic whose visions came directly from God. Still others presented her as a clever woman who used careful observation and logical deduction to predict her owner's downfall. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between history and legend, between fact and the deeper truths that facts sometimes fail to capture. Celia Washington had indeed lived, had indeed possessed an uncanny ability to predict events before they occurred, and had indeed been executed for crimes that existed more in white imagination than legal reality. But she had also become something larger than historical fact. She had become memory, story, inspiration, and warning, all wrapped into one indestructible narrative. Today, Visitors to Richmond can find a small historical marker near the site where the courthouse once stood, commemorating the trial of a slave woman who was executed for allegedly predicting her master's deaths. But the real monument to Celia Washington exists in the countless retellings of her story, in the generations of people who found courage in her example, in the enduring power of prophecy to transform victim into victor through the simple act of seeing clearly what others refuse to acknowledge. The Seeress of Richmond had achieved the ultimate revenge against slavery, immortality through story, power through memory, freedom through legend that no master could ever chain or kill or own.